Welcome to a review video for Week 6 Development Assignment 2. I've copied and pasted the requirements for the assignment right here in an untitled file so we can walk through them and discuss different approaches to completing this assignment. So the very first part here, it says create a new React project using npx create-react-app week 6. So the first thing we actually want to do is make sure we've opened up our local cloned repository on our computer. So you see, I've already done that here, and I've got my fall 2020 mobile development, and of course, I've already opened a new terminal. Excuse me. So now that we've opened everything, let's do part one. Part one asks us to npx create-react-app and week 6. And we will press enter. So this can take a considerable amount of time. So let's talk through these other steps while it's doing that. So once it finishes, the next 3 things we want to do as part of part 2 is we want to create a new directory called components inside the source folder, which will be the next thing we will do. Then we want to create a new directory inside that called example. And then we want to create a new file called index.js, lowercase index.js inside the folder example. At that point, we're given some choices. So we need to create a component because React uses components. So our 2 possible options here are either a functional component, that is a component using functions, which gives us an opportunity to either use a function or an arrow function, or a class component. So 2 different possible options there. And of course, we then want to name it example, and we want to make sure that file exports out the thing we create. Finally, within part 3, we want to also add this content right here. So depending on the type of component we use, be it functional or class, it needs to either return, of course, if it's functional, that is based on functions, or if it's a class component, it needs to render this. So we need to say, hi, my name is, and then of course replace your name with whatever our actual name is. In this case, I will replace it with Dan Cox. So in that case, then we also have some couple different options to approach that. One way might be to either hard code, hi, my name is, and just put, in my case, Dan Cox into that. Or if we use a class component, we could pass in via attributes from app.js into this, our name. That is one possible approach. Or we could, again, approach it using props in a functional way. Or again, so to say, a more common, easier approach would just be to hard code those values. So finally, once all that's done, over here in part 4, we want to make sure we import it in. And then finally, as part 5, we want to use the element, the Jsx form, that will then be combined when it's parsed from the element form into the object form. And then finally down here, a reminder, we need to update our GitHub repository, which I also have GitHub Desktop pulled up as well. It's just not currently shown. And we'll talk about that once we get to that step. So multiple steps here, and again, we sort of have to wait for this to be created. But the good news is once all of this is done, which again can take a few minutes depending on bandwidth and computers and everything else, but once it's done creating everything, we'll have it, and then we can sort of test things as we go. The other thing that's highly recommended since we're using React projects is to use the Npm Start or Npm Run Start option. This will give us a development server and show us, using live reload, our changes in real time. So anytime we save the file, it detects a change, updates the project within the browser. So we'll actually be running that command once everything finishes. So our steps then, of course, is to start with this, part 1. Part 2, we need to create a new directory called components. Again, create a new directory called example. This is just getting us in this workflow. We're creating components, creating a new directory for that component, and then creating a new file, index.js, within that new component folder. This is just, like I said, getting us in this workflow of things we're going to be doing for future assignments. Then as part 3, we have some options. Like as I discussed, we can use a functional component if we prefer that, or a class component if we prefer that. They're exactly the same within React. They're just sort of used for different purposes or different styles or approaches. And then again, depending on what we need to do, if we write a functional component, it either needs to return, or if we're creating a class component, it needs to render. And of course, we have our text right here using paragraph tags, returning this. So while I'm waiting for this, the other thing I want to highlight is because this is a single root element, it still abides by the 3 Jsx rules, which again are 1 root element, all elements need to close, and only JavaScript expressions are allowed. So this is one root element right here. It only has a single element. It is the root element. So the paragraph tag is totally fine. It also closes. It has an opening tag and a closing tag, and we're not really using JavaScript expressions or anything else, so that totally works here. So again, we're abiding by the 3 JSX rules. And then when we come down here into part 4, something we could probably do, as most people would, is use a self-closing tag. So we would have example as a named component with a capital E, matching the name of the component we're creating, and then it would self-close within the same tag. We could use an opening tag and closing tag. It's kind of a preference thing, but it's generally easier just to create a self-closing tag. And of course, that would be, again, part of 4 and part of 5, and then once we have that, we would have it done. Now, down here in part 5, I'll mention this sort of parenthetical aside here. It says this should be inside the existing div, but can be put at any point within that. The reason why this is particularly interested is, again, comes back to those 3 rules of JSX. We need one root element, all elements must close, and we can only use JavaScript expressions. So one root element is why this particular parenthetical is listed here. So in parenthetical is within parentheses as the end of a sentence here, or within something else. So this parenthetical exists to just sort of remind us that, like, we need one root element. So if we have a paragraph tag moved into another component, it needs to be wrapped in something, that one root element rule, and so we can use the existing div tag. We also have the options of erasing the text that's already there, which I'm actually going to do because the assignment didn't say I couldn't do that. And so we will then move into that as well. So we're just waiting for this last final post-installation tasks to finish up, and then we will be ready. Okay, so now everything is done. So notice down here, it says happy hacking, and then there it goes, finally resolves. And so we have over here week 6 in green, because these are all new changes. I will open this up and then come down here to source. Okay, so let's scroll back up. Part 1 is done, so I'm going to go ahead and erase this from our requirements. So now let's look at part 2. I need to create a new directory called components inside of the source folder. I'm going to select the source folder right here. I'm going to, up here, create a new folder, call this components, and press enter. Then within this, I need to create a new directory called example. So making sure components is selected, create a new folder called example. Then making sure example is selected, create a new file called index.js. Okay, so now we're on our way. Let's double check. We did part 2, create a new directory, create a new directory, create a new file. Fantastic. Let's wipe out part 2. Part 3. So this is where we get our options, right? We can either create a functional or a class component. Again, they're the same within React, just depends on our style and what we're doing and other qualifications. So it needs to be named example. So that's our main requirement, and it could be functional or class. I'm going to use a functional component here. But before I do that, there's an important rule we must always remember. And this is sort of an unwritten rule about React. And in fact, the React documentation doesn't always go into why this is needed, but is absolutely always needed. So anytime we are creating a new component within React, which is just about every time we're creating a new file, we always need to import React. This tells the first processing, again, process twice. First time converts the JSX, the XML, into JavaScript. The second time parses the JavaScript itself. The first parsing run looks for React within the file. It says, hey, is this a React? Something I need to care about. If it does, it will treat it as React. So very first thing we always need to be doing when creating new components is importing React. So I'm just going to put a simple import React from React. That's all I'm doing. I'm not going to import component because I want to create a functional component which doesn't depend on that parent class. So import React from React. We need that line at least if we're creating a new component, and we have it here. So if I'm creating a functional component, I've got a couple different ways I could approach this. The first and maybe easiest, if you're more familiar with this, is to actually create a function. So the function name, the function keyword, the function name, open and close parentheses, etc. The other approach would be to use an arrow function, and if I was using arrow function, I'd probably want to send it to the value of a variable, and then we'd export out that variable. That's the easier approach. So I'm going to go ahead and just make this a function, call example. Then I want to export out. So usually this will be one of the first few things I'll write. I will write the name of the component and then immediately write export default. There is another style we could approach. We could in fact write export default right here on line 3 because it would work the same. The thing we are exporting would still be the same, but again, stylistic choice. Okay, I'm using a functional component, which means it needs to return something. So the thing it's going to return, I'm going to go ahead and tab in, will be this. And what does it need to return? Well, I already have it right here. Let's copy and paste. I need to return, copy, paste. And I'm going to change this right here to Dan Cox. So notice as soon as we had some JSX, this HTML looking element syntax, the React suddenly brightened. This is what we need it for. Anytime we're using JSX, we should import React. And in fact, you should just go ahead and import React nearly always, just in case. There are, of course, some examples where you won't need it, but go ahead and use it because chances are you're probably going to be using JSX. So, okay, this is pretty much done. We importing React, we've got our functional component example. It is returning some HTML. It is following the Jsx rules of, again, one root element. It's got it, open and closing elements, it's got it, open and closing tags, and only JavaScript expressions are allowed, which we're not using, so that rules doesn't really apply here. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this. So on my computer, Control S, and under Windows, if you're running in Macs, it would be Command S for the keyboard assignments. So okay, let's move back over here. Part 3 was create a component, either functional or class, named example, that either returns or renders, again, depending on the type of component, either functional or class, and it needs to return the following, which right here, hi, my name is, and then our actual name. Part 3 is done. So let's go ahead and scratch this off as well. So let's move on to part 4. Part 4 says to import the created component into app.js. So app.js is outside the components folder. It is right here. Go ahead and open this right here. Anytime we import, we use relative paths, which means we're probably going to be using the / format, so / something. So let's go ahead and just add it to the end, just to be a little bit lazy. Import, what are we importing? The thing we're importing should match the thing that's being exported from the file, which is example, with an uppercase E. Where is it at? So where from? It is single quotations, /, again, relative paths. It is in components, and it is in example. And I'm going to close this with a semicolon. Now notice I didn't add the index.js to the end. React is smart enough to know that it will look for, by default, an index.js, lowercase index.js file. And so we have this set up right here, import example from components example. All set. Well, sort of all set. The last thing we need to do is I'm going to go ahead and save this. So Control S, just so we have it saved. Come over here. This says import. Part 4, done. Fantastic. Let's look at part 5. Part 5 says include the element, the JSX form of the created component inside app.js. Again, it should be inside its existing div, but can be put at any point within it. So we have some options here. We could be lazy and just stick it down here, or we just say, you know what, I don't want any of this. Take it all out. And put example in its JSX form, in its element form, right within this right here. I'm going to actually clean this up a little bit and go ahead and remove these. This is completely optional since I'm not really using this CSS or this file. And so the only two things I actually need in the most technical sense is React, again, because I'm using JSX, we've got to import React. And again, good practice just to import React anyway, just in case you need it. And we're importing example. And so we have the div, one root element, again, thinking of Jsx rules, and we have example here in the JSX form. It is a self-closing tag. So let's go ahead and save this. And let's look back over here, and it says, okay, include, and it could be anywhere in existing div, and so part 5 is done. There's one last step that's not very specifically mentioned within those existing steps. That is, always test our code. We want to see that does this actually work the way we think it does? So if we're in React, again, we can use its existing npm scripts. The most common script we will be using, the most common npm script we will be using with React is npm start, or if you prefer, npm run start. They're the same thing. So npm start. And so what this will do, yes, so another error right here. So it says, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. And it's correct. We need to change directory into the one we just created, which I temporarily forgot. Change directory into week 6. And then from here, npm start. And give it just a moment, and then it will start up a development server when it is ready. So it's, again, highly recommended to use the development server. And this is actually opening it over here in another window, so I'll wait till it's started and then I'll move the tab over for us. So give us just a moment for the development server to get going. Okay, so I'm going to pull this up in Firefox so we can see it. And then I will move this window over and maximize it. So there we go. My name is Dan Cox, exactly as the assignment requirements have. We are showing our name, we have a created component, and we are using React. So to go back through the multiple steps of this assignment, let's jump back over to Visual Studio Code. Very first step was to run npx create react-app space, and then week 6 in this example. That was part 1. We created a new React app. Part 2 was to create the folders, and that just gets us into the practice of creating the components folder and then whatever extra folders for components we need. We created the components folder, then we created a folder example, and then inside example, we created a new file, index.js, which was this right here. Then I had some possible options. I could either create a functional component or a class component. I opted for a functional component just because it's less code to write for this particular example. We could have also done a class component. Again, they're totally equal in React, and it kind of depends on what you're using it for in a more advanced sense, but for this, it didn't really matter. So that was the extra part there. So the next step in order then was to import this into app.js, which we did right here. We imported an example. So again, the thing we import is the thing being exported. This exports example, capital E. This imports example, capital E, matches those files. Then we needed to use its JSX form, its XML form, and then we have an element right here with a capital E and as a self-closing tag. Following the JSX rules, again, right here, one root element, the division div tag being used here, and example within that. Then we moved into just verifying everything works. So we used npm start, again, within the directory that the project is found in, which was the problem I saw, which again, we all make mistakes. And so I caught myself, I moved into the week 6, ran npm start, verified it in the browser, and I showed it over here, pulled it over here to Firefox to verify everything worked. So everything works. So down here then, if we want to stop this, and there's sort of 2 different approaches to this. Normally we would press Control-C. So I'm going to see if this works. Okay, and I would say, yes, I want to terminate the batch job. Okay, so in Windows we can do that and it will terminate. And we can do, again, Control-C. Sometimes down here, it doesn't always catch input. So if that was ever the case, we could terminate down here and kill the terminal and then start a new one. It's a little annoying, but sometimes it happens in Visual Studio Code. Okay, everything's now ready. I need to do the last thing, which was make sure we commit the changes. So I'm going to move over to GitHub Desktop, which I also have pulled up. And notice I now have 19 changed files. I'm going to call this week 6. Again, we have to have a summary for the commit, and a commit is a collection of changes. Week 6. I want to commit this to master, which is the main branch of my repository. So I need at least a summary. I could possibly have a description if I want, and then I have all of my changes. Again, a commit is a collection of changes. I need at least a summary, so we have week 6, and I'm going to click commit. And it will create a commit locally. So now my local cloned code on my local machine is one commit ahead of the remote origin, which is to say it is one commit ahead of GitHub. When this happens, GitHub Desktop says, hey, do you mean to push this to GitHub? And I click the push origin, or I could have clicked push origin over here. It will push it to GitHub. Okay, and then I will move, and then I am technically done. So my last step then, if I was a student, would be to submit the URL to either my repo or this particular project for week 6. And then the professor would grade it, and then I would have a grade. So again, to review this project, as will be common steps throughout a lot of these projects, is to always start with npx create-react-app if we're using React. When we get into React Native, this will be slightly different. But for right now, we're using React, and I'll go ahead and close this, and I don't want to save that file. We're creating a new React app. Then, as we're adding new components, again, getting us into this workflow, we're creating a components directory, creating a directory per component, and then within each components directory, creating that index.js file, all lowercase, for that component. And then, of course, we are given some options. We can create a functional component, a class component, depending on what we're doing, what we want to write. And then, of course, we want to import those in this case, import into app.js. And more complex projects, we may want to import in other components within this folder. If we have a bunch of them, maybe they import into each other. And of course, as we get into more complex projects, we may see those examples. And then, of course, once everything's done, we want to go ahead and test our code, again, using npm start down here, making sure, of course, we're in the correct directory. So in this case, week 6, it may be another folder in the future. And using npm start, it will open in the browser. We can test to see if everything works. If it doesn't work, we can adjust our code. And because npm start uses a development server with live reloading, anytime we save the file, it would refresh in the browser, and we can quickly move across and say, oh, that doesn't work, here's this change. Oh, that doesn't work, here's this change, and get it to work. So again, we should always test our code, and React makes it incredibly simple to test our code very quickly. So this has been a review of the week 6 assignment, walking through all of its parts. If there's any confusion for people watching this video who are not in my class, I can't help you, but if you're actually in my class, please contact me and we can talk through it and make sure you understand all of these different parts and all of the processes that go into these assignments.